the Associate Director of Asian American Studies, and it's my delight to welcome so many new faces and some really wonderful friends that we have not seen in a while to our talk. Today is the last day of the Asian American Studies Fellows Colloquium, but do stay tuned for information coming up soon as we begin the new year. We're going to be hosting 3 consecutive symposiums that the fellows are organizing, again, around the foreign body. So there are 2 sessions in March and 1 in April where we will host, guest speakers, national experts, as well as local community activists, all around the topic of the foreign body. So please stay tuned for more information for that. And if you have not yet signed up for our listserv, I welcome you to do so. It's on our front page of the ASAM website, which is asam.sas.upenn. And we can certainly post that in the chat. There's a tiny subscribe button at the bottom of the page. So I encourage all of you to sign up and be connected to our events. And we have lots of wonderful things happening in the spring. So without waiting anymore, I want to introduce our speaker today, Tiffany Tieu, who is a junior from Cheltenham, Pennsylvania. She's studying psychology and holds a research position at Penn Medicine and the Hunt Lab. As a member of the College Cognoscenti, Tiffany serves as a student ambassador and gives weekly presentations about the College of Arts and Sciences to prospective students. She's also involved in the peer advising program, research peer advising program, Penn Traditions, and the Penn Undergraduate Psychology Society. She's interested in minority mental health and improving the lives of those struggling with mental illness. Tiffany has conducted research on mental health in the Asian community and hopes to build upon her work throughout the Asian American Studies Fellows Program. So welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. So I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. Okay, can you guys see this? Is everything working properly? Okay, great. So thank you everyone for attending my presentation today. It's so exciting to see so many new faces. And today I'll be talking about the model minority myth and its impact on academic stress and mental health help-seeking attitudes. Okay, so first I'm going to give a brief overview of the model minority myth. I'm sure everyone in the audience knows what it is, but I thought it'd be helpful to just give a brief overview about it. So the model minority myth has racist and political roots in the United States, and it has this single depiction of Asian Americans as a group of people who are very successful and people who are hardworking and don't need any additional help or assistance. And it presents this single depiction despite differences among Asian ethnicities. So it kind of adds to why some people may think that we are a very homogeneous population when in fact we aren't. And the myth also intends to contrast Asian Americans from other minority groups. More specifically, it was used to put us against other minorities. And like it was basically trying to say that if Asian Americans can get to where they are today without any help or assistance, why can't other minorities follow suit and do the same thing? Also, there is a negative and ongoing impact. So even though the model minority myth was created years ago, it's still prevalent today. And I can speak from personal experience that I know that it's still something that is in the United States, and it has perpetuated stereotypes about Asian Americans that are still present today, and beliefs that some people may still think about Asian American people. So now I'm going to give a brief overview about mental health in the Asian community, and then on the next slide, I will connect both the model minority myth and mental health since they're both related to my topic. So first, Asian American adults are the least likely to use mental health resources, and Asian American college students had more suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts compared to white American college students. In addition, Asian students have higher rates of depression and less positive feelings about their ethnic group. And lastly, in the Asian community, there are like negative cultural beliefs and stigma surrounding like mental illness and mental health care. And also some Asian individuals might be afraid to seek appropriate mental help because of language barriers. And also they might experience racism and discrimination while accessing these services. Okay, so now I'm going to connect the model minority myth and mental health since they're both related to my topic. So um, this pressure to succeed, which is associated with the model minority myth, it produces an intolerable amount of stress, and that has contributed to Asian American women's suicidality. So there have been studies that have shown this. In addition, studies have also shown that internalization of the model minority myth affects psychological distress, and this contributes to the high levels of pressure and anxiety that Asian Americans experience. So I also wanted to talk about my own personal interest and past research that I have done that relates to mental health in the Asian community, and hopefully this will give you guys some more about my personal background as to why I'm very interested in this topic and why I decided to pursue this for my project through the ASAM Fellows Program this year. So growing up as an Asian American, I have observed these negative like cultural beliefs and stigma surrounding mental illness and mental health care in my own family. I have witnessed and participated in conversations with some of my relatives who basically were arguing that mental illness was not a thing and that it wasn't important to seek appropriate mental help, and that mental health care was just like not necessary. And I also remember one of my relatives once saying that everyone in our family had no reason to struggle with their mental health because we should be happy that we have everything that we have today. So that's some of like my personal experience with this topic. And I feel like because of that, I am like even more motivated to do more research in this area and just like contribute to the field of research in regard to mental health in the Asian community. In addition, I do hope to attend graduate school for clinical psychology in the future, and clinical psych is basically mental illness and treatment. And I'm hoping to conduct more research in the field of mental health in the Asian community and also work with minority patients and help them with their mental health. And also, I'm hoping to help provide greater access to mental health resources to minority populations, and also help develop culturally sensitive services for minority patients to access in the future. In addition, I wanted to note that in 2018, the American Psychological Association did a study on diversity in the field of psychology, and actually only 5% of workers in the field of psychology in the United States were Asian. So there's like this huge gap between like the different minority groups and like their involvement in the field of psychology. So I'm hoping that I will help contribute to this and become an Asian psychologist in the future and work with minority patients. And lastly, at Penn, I have also conducted research on the efforts to expand mental health resources to Asians in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So I conducted interviews with mental health providers in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but there was more like focus on the Philadelphia area. And I'm hoping that the research that I have done for the ASAM Fellows Program will help contribute to that research as well. So now I'm going to talk more about my study. So the purpose of my study was to help identify factors that were related to the association between internalization of the model minority myth and mental health outcomes. So studies have shown that internalization of the model minority myth is related to poorer mental health outcomes of Asian individuals. However, studies have not provided explanations as to like why is there this relationship. So I was hoping to better identify the factors associated with this. And more specifically, I investigated whether internalization of the model minority myth is associated with the academic stress and mental health help-seeking attitudes of Asian college students at Penn. So I created an online survey and I distributed it to Asian college students at Penn. So my survey included 3 measures. And then at the end, I also included some demographic questions about just like their gender, their year, and their specific Asian ethnicity. So the first scale that participants completed was the Academic Expectation Stress Inventory. And the short name for that is AESI, and I'll be referring to the scale as that throughout this presentation. And that scale, it assesses perceived expectations and pressure from oneself, parents, and teachers. The second scale that participants completed was the internalization of the model minority myth measure. And this scale assesses beliefs that Asian Americans are more successful than other minority groups. And then the last scale that they completed was the attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help short form. And that was used to assess mental health help seeking attitudes. And as I mentioned before, at the end of the survey, there were also demographic questions that just asked about like their age, their gender, their specific Asian ethnicity, their generation, how long they've been living in the US, and et cetera. So in terms of participant recruitment, so I reached out to many different Asian clubs and organizations and college houses to help recruit participants. Um, so most of my participants came from ASAM courses. So there were students in ASAM courses at Penn. They also heard about it from different Asian clubs and organizations, the college houses. So I reached out to the college houses and they like shared information about my study to their residents. And then also SBSI, which stands for the Social and Behavioral Science Initiative. And it's a site that the psychology department uses to provide monetary compensation to participants. So I was able to also add my study to that site and recruit some participants from there. All of my participants completed a consent form, so they agreed to participate in the study and they were allowed to drop the study at any time. So while they were completing the survey, if they did not want to complete it anymore, they were able to drop it. But all of them provided consent and agreement to participate in the study. All participants also received gift card compensation. So it was either to Amazon or Starbucks. I allowed them to choose which store they wanted the gift card to go to, but everyone was compensated. The survey only took about 7 to 10 minutes to complete, but I thought it was still nice to provide compensation to thank people for participating in the study. And before I forget, I do want to say thank you to everyone who helped me recruit participants and share information about my study. I know that a lot of the ASAM faculty like shared information about it to their ASAM courses, and I was able to get a lot of ASAM students through there. And also thank you to the ASAM Fellows this year and all the other Asian clubs and organizations that helped me recruit participants. And if you are in the audience now and actually completed my survey, thank you so much for participating in my study and completing the survey. So in regard to my sample, so I had a total of 217 participants, and I was very pleased with this, and it surpassed my initial target goal of participants. I had participants from all 4 undergraduate years, so I had freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and senior students, and I had a roughly equal amount of each class year. In regard to gender, I had 183 females, 33 males, and then 1 non-binary participant. So I did have a larger amount of females, but later on you'll see that I still saw some significant gender differences. In addition, I also recruited participants from various Asian ethnicities and generations, but I do want to note that most of my study sample were Chinese individuals, followed by Indian and Korean American students. And in terms of the generations, most of my students were second generation, so they were born and raised in the United States. But following that, I also had first generation students, people who were 1.5 generation and third generation students, and also some international students. Okay, so this is the first data table that I'm going to present to you guys. I know there are a lot of values, so I'm gonna give a simple overview of it. So this is looking at the means of the total scores by ethnicity. So I conducted statistical analysis and I calculated the means for the responses per each scale. So as you can see here, I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse, but hopefully you guys can. So for the ethnicity, you could see I listed all of the different ethnicities that people identified with in my study. So you can see here China. So there were 125 Chinese students, which was the largest ethnic group in my study. And then after that, that was Indian. So I had 34 Indian participants, and then Korean, which was 21. And then we also had like 16 Taiwanese students and 16 Vietnamese students. But for like the rest of them, like for Japanese, I only had one student. Malaysian, I only had four. Mongolian, I only had one. So I did have an imbalanced sample size in regard to ethnicities because I didn't have like an equal amount per ethnicity. So because of that, I unfortunately was not able to conduct significance tests to see if the data presented in this table is statistically significant. But we can see that all of these values are different from each other. So like in general, it's looking like the different ethnicities do show different levels of academic stress, internalization of the model minority myth, and different levels of their attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help. But unfortunately, I was not able to conduct statistical significance tests to see if this data is actually significant. But we can see that there might be some differences, and with a larger sample size, we might be able to see if the values are actually statistically significant. So this is where the data gets really interesting. So this is the second table I'm going to go over with you guys, and it's for gender. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, I listed the different genders and how many students I had per gender. So I had 183 females, 33 males, and then one non-binary participant. But we won't really be focusing on the person who identified as non-binary just because it's not statistically reasonable to compare like a sample size of one compared to the 183 females. So I can only really compare the difference between the females and the males. So as you can see here at the top, I listed the different scales. So the AESI, again, that's the academic expectation stress inventory. And then the IM4, that's the internalization of the model minority myth measure. And then I also have the attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help measure here. So these are the means and then the standard deviations. So you look here for the academic expectation stress inventory. And if you look at females and males, you could see that females had a mean of 35.3 and then males had a mean of 32.1. And you could see that for females, this mean is higher than the mean for males. So this is suggesting that females in my study showed higher levels of academic stress and higher levels of pressure and expectations from their parents, teachers, and from their self compared to males. Now looking in the middle at the internalization of the model minority myth measure. So again, this was assessing their beliefs that Asian Americans were more successful than other minority groups. So as you can see here, so 57.6, that's the mean for female students, and then 65.1 is the mean for male students. And the mean for males is higher than the mean for females. So that is suggesting that males in my study internalized the model minority myth more than females did. And then for the last one, which is attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help, so how willing they were to seek appropriate mental help when necessary. So for females, you had a mean of 25.8, and then for males, you have a mean of 24.8. So it's not like as large as a difference as you saw for the academic stress and the internalization of the model minority myth, but there is still the slight difference. And maybe like with more participants in the future, there might be like an even like wider discrepancy between these two values. But right now we can just say that it is suggesting that females have more positive attitudes towards seeking appropriate mental help compared to the males in my study. Okay, so now I'm going to look at generation. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, I listed the different generations. So first generation meant that you were an immigrant. 1.5 generation means that you arrived to the United States at an early age. Second generation means that you were born and raised in the United States. Third generation means that both you and your parents were born and raised in the United States. And then international meant that you were an international student. And as I mentioned before, I had a very large amount of second generation students. So I had 155 second generation students. And then the second largest group was then the 1.5 generation. And then here again, I listed the different scales. So the AESI is the Academic Expectation Stress Inventory. The IM4 is the Model Minority Myth Measure. And then the last one are attitudes towards seeking appropriate mental help. So we're going to look at the means again here. So you look here under the AESI, and then if you look from first generation to third generation, you can see that these values actually increase as you go down the generation. So you see like 33.2, and then it goes to 33.9, and then 35.1, and then 38.3. So that is suggesting that as you go down the generations, like people might be showing more like higher levels of academic stress and higher levels of like pressure from their parents and their teachers and their self. And then now if you look in the middle for the internalization of the model minority myth measure, and then again look at first generation to third generation. So you could see that there's actually a decrease in values as you go down the generation. So you see for first generation, you have 62.2, and then for 1.5, you have 60. For second generation, you have 58.0, and then third generation, you have 44.3. So there is actually a decrease in these values as you go down the generations, and that is suggesting that as you go down these generations, people are showing lower levels of internalization of the model minority myth, which is really interesting. And then now looking at the attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help measure. So the values for this one, they aren't too different from each other. So I'm not going to focus on it as much as I did for the previous two scales, but you can see like there are different means, but they aren't too far apart from one another. So I don't want to like assume anything or say that like certain generations may have had like more willingness to seek appropriate mental help when necessary. So this is the last table that I'm going to show you guys today. So this is just looking at scale correlations. So as I mentioned before, I used 3 scales in my study. And just to see like if the scales were correlated with one another, I ran a correlational test. So I know there are a lot of values. So I'm just gonna like go over a few of the ones that are highlighted in yellow. So as you can see here, this one, it's the attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help measure. And then right here is the academic expectation stress inventory. So if you could see for that one, there is a correlation of 0.281. And the 2 stars indicate that it was statistically significant. So the p-value was less than 0.01. And when you use p-values, when you're doing stat analysis, if it's less than 0.05, it means that it was significant. If it's less than 0.01, it means that it was even more significant. So here we have a correlation of 0.281. And that is not a very high correlation. It's actually a small correlation, but it's not saying that like academic stress and like attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help aren't associated with each other, but it's just saying that for these 2 scales, they might not really be as correlated with each other as we had hypothesized. And you could see like for all the other values that I indicated in yellow, these are pretty small correlations. So there was nothing like greater than 0.3. So all of these correlations are pretty small, but it's not saying that like academic expectations and that like pressure from your teachers, parents, and yourself. It's not saying that those aren't related with like internalization of the model minority myth and like willingness to seek out appropriate mental help. It's just saying that the scales that I chose to use in my survey may not have had as high correlations as I had expected. And also, you could see like here at the top and across all of the scales actually. So like here's the AESI and then the parents, teachers, and the self. These are subscales of the academic expectation stress inventory. And then here I also have listed the same scale. And if you could see, these correlations are very high. So you have like 0.907, 0.756, and like 0.907 here. And that is not surprising to me because it's basically seeing if the scale is correlated with itself. So you could see like for all of the scales, it correlated with itself. So I'm not surprised about that. Okay, so this is a question that I included in the demographic section of my survey. And it was just to get an idea as to like the different like people and mental health resources that participants in my study might reach out to if they are struggling with their mental health. So the question was asking if you have difficulty in managing your academic stress, mental health, and or well-being, who would be the best person or resource to talk to and to check all that apply. So as you could see here, most people said their friends and peers, um, and then followed by parents, siblings, and a professional. And a professional would be a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or like a mental health counselor. But I thought it was interesting just because like a lot of people, so around 200 participants said that they would reach out to their friends first, as opposed to all of these other people. So just some like takeaways from the data that I just presented with you guys. I know there were a lot of values in those tables, but um, I like found that second generation individuals have lower levels of internalizing the model minority myth compared to first generation and 1.5 generation students. In addition, I also saw some gender differences. So females show higher levels of academic stress and willingness to seek mental help if necessary. And then also I saw that males show higher levels of internalizing the model minority myth compared to female students in my study. And I also wanted to connect my project to the Asian community at Penn and talk about more like Penn specific findings since I only recruited Penn students and you had to be a Penn student to participate in my study. So in general, when I was looking at the different items in the scales and how people were responding to them, a higher percentage of students were showing lower levels of internalizing the model minority myth and higher levels of willingness to seek mental help if necessary. So if you remember in the beginning when I was telling you guys about like background information and research relating to the model minority myth and mental health in the Asian community, I was hypothesizing that like if you show higher levels of internalizing the model minority myth, then you would have lower levels of willingness to seek out appropriate mental help. So I did not see that in my study. I actually saw the reverse. So I saw that lower levels of internalizing the model minority myth is associated with an increase in willingness to seek appropriate mental help if necessary. So this might be something that's just specific to Penn students. So in my study, as I said before, I only recruited Penn students. So you might only see this relationship when you're examining Penn students. If I were to include students from other universities, that might be a different story and I might have different findings. But this is like a unique finding to Penn students. Um, and I also wanted to note that when I was like thinking more about this relationship and why I was seeing like the reverse effect rather than my original hypothesis, I thought about how like there are a lot of initiatives and discussions at Penn regarding the model minority myth and mental health in the Asian community. So I've taken ASAM courses before, and we have always talked about the model minority myth and how it has this negative impact on Asian Americans and even today. And also, like, I know that different Asian groups at Penn have had like discussions and conversations about mental health in the Asian community. So I think that at Penn, there's just like more awareness about the negative impact of the model minority myth and more willingness to just like discuss Asian American mental health. So that might be something that um, is affecting this relationship that we're seeing among Penn students. And I think it's a good thing that we have all these initiatives and discussions about like mental health in the Asian community at Penn, because like it seems to be a good thing. And I definitely think it's something that we should like continue to have in the future. But I do want to note that even though I'm seeing this reverse effect, it doesn't mean that mental health in the Asian community at Penn is not important, because if you look at this bar chart that I created, so um, in the attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help measure, there's a question that is I might want to have psychological counseling in the future. And if you can see here, a lot of students are indicating some level of agreement with it. And in fact, 85% of students indicated that they either agree or partly agree to this statement. So a lot of people in my study sample have indicated that they might want to consider psychological counseling in the future. So I'm gonna go back to the slide now. Um, like mental health in the Asian community is still a very important topic that should be discussed and addressed at Penn. And in addition, going back to the academic expectation stress inventory and the questions that I asked with that scale. So in general, when I was looking at the item level analysis for that scale, the students in my sample were showing higher levels of like pressure from their parents, their teachers, and their self, and expectations as well. So I don't want you to think that Asian community at mental health in the Asian community at Penn is something that shouldn't be addressed, because a lot of students are showing like increased willingness to seek appropriate mental help. It's still like something that should be addressed and something that we should still focus on, because the mental health of our Asian students is very important. Okay, and then in terms of future research, so in the future, I would hope to recruit more students from the different ethnicities and generations. So if you remember, I had like an imbalanced sample size in regards to the ethnicity. So I had a lot of Chinese students and Indian and Korean students, but not much of the other different ethnicities. So I'm hoping that I can recruit students of these different Asian ethnicities, and hopefully that will help me um, like look further into the findings and be able to conduct like test on the statistical significance of those values. And in addition, I had many students who were second generation, but it would be helpful to recruit a sample of students who belong to the first generation categories and like 1.5 generation and third generation, just so I can like do more analysis on the differences between the generations. And it's just helpful to have like a more equal sample size for those categories. In addition, I had a lot of female participants compared to males. So it would be helpful to recruit more male students, just so I can like do more analysis on differences between the two genders, because it's just helpful to have like a roughly equal sample size for both genders. In addition, I would like to see if the findings are maintained with students at different universities. So since I only included a sample of people from Penn, we might see different findings if I were to distribute this survey to students at different universities. And also, if you remember, I said that second generation students were showing lower levels of internalizing the model minority myth. So I might want to do some future research on the current prevalence of the model minority myth. So is it in fact something that is kind of like decreasing as you go down the generations, and are like the generations showing like lower levels of internalizing the model minority myth? Lastly, I would like to do some research on how to develop culturally sensitive mental health services. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, the mental health of Asian students at Penn is still very important, and 85% of them indicated some level of agreement that they might want to consider psychological counseling in the future. So I think their mental health is something that we should still address, and I would like to do some future research on how to develop culturally sensitive mental health services. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'm now happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.
Great, thank you so much, Tiffany. So, if anyone has a question, certainly just unmute yourselves, and certainly you could also share any thoughts or comments in the chat.
Can I give a go at starting?
Of course.
First, Tiffany, thank you so much. Excellent work, excellent work.
Thank
I
you.
wonder if you could just clarify what internalizing the model minority myth means.
Yeah, so the researchers who developed this scale, they noted that in terms of like internalizing the model minority myth, it was like how often do you incorporate these beliefs into like your values on a daily basis? So how often do you incorporate beliefs about like the model minority myth into like your current values and on a daily basis?
Meaning that if I'm internalizing the myth, I'm basically living my life as though I believe that I'm a mono minority.
Yes, that is correct.
And that I should have no problems, that I'm a big success.
That is correct.
Okay. And what do you make of the sort of your finding that as the generations progress, that the internalization of that idea becomes less and less?
Yeah, so I thought that finding was very interesting and I was surprised when I saw it. So you would expect that for second generation students, since you were born and raised in the United States, that you might be more affected by the model minority myth, and because of that, might internalize it more often than like international students or people who are just coming to America. But I did see that second generation students had lower levels of internalizing the myth. So I thought a lot about that finding, and I think it might be because like since second generation students were born and raised in the US, they might have more like experience and they were able to see that the model minority myth has a lot of inaccuracies and that it has like a lot of negative effects. So because of that, they might be more willing to admit that the model minority myth like is just like not true and that it has like a lot of inaccuracies and that it's something that shouldn't be like continue to be recognized today and that those beliefs shouldn't be like maintained in individuals.
Okay, one final sort of thought question, then I'll close my comment. But I wonder what you think about, and others perhaps, about this notion that perhaps as the generations progress, that there's this thinking that my success is not a function of my minorityness.
Yeah, so in the model minority myth measure, actually, it included some questions regarding to like achievement orientation. So one of the questions was like, when comparing to other racial minorities, but more specifically, like African Americans and Hispanics and like Native Americans, like, do you believe, or it was actually asking like to rate how much you agree with the statement that Asian Americans are harder workers and that Asian Americans are more successful because they're harder workers. And also there are some questions about like Asian Americans perform higher on the SAT and like the ACT because of their values in like academic achievement. So I did have some questions in the internalization of the model minority myth that were addressing that, and like participants were mainly saying that they didn't agree that like Asian Americans were harder workers compared to other minority groups. So they were showing like lower levels of internalizing the myth, and a lot of them like disagreed with statements like that.
I have a little bit of a follow-up. I was also, first of all, excellent work, Tiffany.
Thank you.
But I was also interested in that generation slide. What do you think about they're internalizing less, but they're more stressed out? I mean, that's kind of interesting. and that kind of increasing stress over the generations. And then the second and slightly unrelated question is, I'd be interested in seeing what happens to your findings if you looked at mixed race students, because that's more and more prevalent as you go down through the generations, especially in my classes. So, the prevalence of the myth for those groups might be interesting too.
Yeah, so I did have some biracial and multiracial students, but unfortunately, I didn't have as many to conduct statistical analysis on that. But in general, I did see that for students who are mixed race, they were showing lower levels of internalizing the model minority myth. So if you kind of visualize it and you like see like the different generations and like just imagine the multiracial students like kind of at the bottom of that. So they're showing like a very small amount of internalizing the myth. So I think that there might be lower levels with that. And that might be because you might have been in the United States for a longer amount of time, or you just like might recognize that like the model minority myth isn't true and that you shouldn't like show levels of internalizing it. And then in regard to your first question, can you repeat that for me again?
Oh, why do you think, well, how did you think about the fact that people were getting more stressed out over the generations? I somehow thought that they would be less stressed.
Yeah, so I think the academic stress, it might be associated with like their pressures from their teachers and like their parents and from themselves. So it might not be something that's like directly relating to beliefs about the model minority myth. And more specifically, the questions in the academic expectation stress inventory were actually like more geared towards like their parents, their teachers, and their self. So, for example, the question was like if I perform poorly on an exam, I feel like I have disappointed my teacher or my parents. And also, in regard to the self subscale for the academic expectation stress inventory, it was asking like, if I don't meet my expectations, like I cannot sleep at night. If I don't perform well, then it affects my self esteem. So, questions like that. So, I feel like the items in the academic expectation stress inventory weren't like directly related to the model minority myth. So that might like help explain why we're seeing like an increase in stress across the generations, but then like a decrease in levels of internalizing the myth as you go down the generations.
I don't know if you captured this, but if it's something that you would be interested in the future, but something that I'm very curious about is whether the demographics of where somebody grew up played an impact on what happens with their own internalization. So whether they grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood or grew up in a neighborhood that had more Asian Americans that they grew up in. Do you have any information about that, or just maybe not related to this research, but just firsthand knowledge of classes that you may have taken that draw from this info?
Yeah, so that is something very interesting to look at. So in the demographic section, I did ask like how many years have they been living in the US and what country they were born in, but I ended up not including that information on my slides just because I had like so much data already and it was like more beneficial to just talk about like generations more broadly. But I think that what you pointed out is something that I definitely should look at in the future. But I do think that there might be differences if you compare like the populations that they have grown up in and like if they lived in like a diverse neighborhood or somewhere that like has more Asian students or somewhere that like kind of lacks diversity in the Asian community. So I think like there might be some differences there and that is something like worthwhile to examine in future research.
Tiffany, I had a question. If thank you so much. That was really excellent work.
Thank you.
So two things. One, I think the biracial, multiracial question is interesting. And I wonder too if it's also related to the perceived Asianness of that individual, right? If they're perceived as having particular characteristics, physical characteristics of being more Asian, do they internalize that more? I mean, that's just something to think about, and their closeness with that particular community, right? That particular part of their ethnic identity, if it's something that they participate in terms of practice, or, you know, if that leads to a heightened sense of internalization. I just am curious about that. The other thing is, you know, I'm curious as to when most of the surveys were completed. I'm just thinking about all of the challenges and conversations that have occurred since the summer, right? And if, given those kinds of conversations or events, or a heightened awareness or sensitivity around issues of race and identity, have impacted your work.
Yeah, so those are really good questions. So in regard to the first question about like perceived Asianness among students who are like biracial or multiracial. So when I was like looking at the values for students who indicated that they were biracial or multiracial, I did see that there were lower levels of internalizing the myth, but I wasn't able to conduct like statistical significance tests just because like I had a very small sample for that. But I do think that in general, they would show lower levels of internalizing the myth, just like based off of that preliminary data. And in regard to your second question about like the summer and how that like kind of impacted like my findings. So I did distribute the survey in October, so 2 months ago. And that was like after the summer. And the findings might have been affected by the events that happened in the summer. And especially like with COVID, like as you guys all know, there has been like a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and attacks against Asian people in America. So I think that might affect like how people perceive like Asians as the model minority. I don't think that, or in general, I think that like Asian students definitely did not feel like a model minority, just like when COVID was on the rise and when like there were like this increase in attacks against Asian people. So that might be a factor that affected my findings. So that might be like one of the reasons as to why like in general Penn students were showing lower levels of internalizing the model minority myth. I think those are really good questions.
Thank you. I think there's a question in the chat for you too.
Okay, let me read it really quickly. Yeah, so there was a study that was looking at, it was comparing both Asian Americans and then white Americans, and it was seeing like their beliefs in the model minority myth. And if I remember correctly, the white Americans were showing like more recognition of the Asian American stereotypes. So more of them were believing in the stereotypes about Asian people compared to Asian American participants.
I have another thing to ask about if there's no one else. But Alan says, what about Blacks?
So the study unfortunately did not include a sample of African Americans. And I think like in general, the topic needs more research on. So some people might be doing more research on that topic today.
So my additional question, Tiffany, is I wonder whether you, as you were undertaking this this effort, if you considered how the influence of model minority myth interacts with these two other frameworks. One around racial identity theory, especially Asian American racial identity theory, and the other framework being the imposter syndrome, and how these two other frameworks might be working together with, interacting with, encountering, sort of intermingling with, sort of notions of the model minority myth and its impact on a student's psychology and mental health.
Yeah, so you mentioned racial identity theory, and what's the second theory again?
Well, imposter syndrome.
Oh, thank you. So I think that in terms of internalizing the model minority myth, like the levels associated with that, there might be a relationship with imposter syndrome. I did not conduct research on that, and I don't think there's been too much research on that area, but I do think there might be some type of association. So if people are showing lower levels of internalizing, there might be lower levels of imposter syndrome, and then vice versa as well. So if there's higher levels of internalizing, there might be higher levels of imposter syndrome. And then you also asked about how does this connect to psychology and the mental health of Asian students. So as I discussed in my presentation with internalizing the myth, research has shown that if you have higher levels of internalizing the myth, you have poorer mental health outcomes. So and then based off of my study and what I found that was specific with Penn students, lower levels of internalizing the myth is associated with more willingness to seek appropriate mental health if necessary. Are there any other questions?
Hi, hello. Oh, okay. So I guess my first things first. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Very good, very good. And then I guess my simple question is, why do you think there was an overwhelming majority of females who responded to this survey?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you so much for joining, Brian. And in regard to your question about why there were so many females, so I also thought about that as well. And I also was talking to Dr. Khan about this earlier this week, but it might be that females are more likely to take surveys like this and just participate in studies like this. But honestly, I don't really know why there were so many females, and also the topic maybe a lot of female students were just interested in it in general. And also I did see some gender differences. So females showed higher levels of academic stress and more positive attitudes towards seeking appropriate mental help. So this topic may have been very relevant to their own beliefs and interests. So those are some possible reasons as to why I recruited so many female participants, but definitely in the future, I would like to recruit a more roughly equal sample size between the two genders.
And I guess a small follow up to that is do you think the idea of toxic masculinity also kind of falls along with the low male turnout? Because I mean, I guess among my male friends, most of them kind of shun mental illness. It's oh, it's a sign of weakness and things like that.
Yeah, so I think that those talks could really affect the findings. So I know at Penn, I believe there are some Asian organizations regarding I don't know if it's the mental health of male students, but I know there are some specific groups just for male Asian students at Penn. And I also know there have been events where you talk about things relating to this. So I think that that could affect the findings. And in my study, I saw that there were higher levels of internalizing the myth for male students. So those talks might lower those levels. And then in terms of the help seeking attitudes, so I didn't see very significant differences for that one in regard to gender, but maybe with those talks there might be more positive attitudes for males in regard to seeking appropriate mental health.
I see. Thank you very much.
Are there any final questions?
Any last questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Tiffany, for your amazing presentation. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. And again, I welcome you to our spring lineup that's coming up and do join our website to stay connected with us. Thank you, everyone.